Sahneyi Bastian'a emanet ediyorum.
All right. Good morning, Istanbul. We should try that again, huh? Good morning, Istanbul. So much better. Fantastic. I'm really honored to be back. I think last time I was here was 2015. The event was way smaller. It's great to see so many more people here. I'm really excited about today. For those of you, who has been here in like 2015, like the early years? Can I get some hands quickly? Some? Okay. So you might remember that I usually talk about technical SEO, so that hasn't changed. That's going to be the same today. I usually have way too much content, so we have 40 minutes. It's going to be tight. I try to not talk too fast. We shall see how that goes. My apologies to the translators in the back. I try to behave. We shall see if that works out. So I kind of want to talk about three different things. They're all somewhat technical SEO related, I guess. And the one thing that really kind of annoys me a lot right now is that Google or Google representatives say something, but on the back of it, they do something entirely different, or the system works entirely different. So communication and kind of what you can trust on is not necessarily always the same. And then there's a lot of people as well that, you know, when they do SEO, they somewhat just rely on recommendations that they have heard from someone, but they didn't actually verify themselves. So you kind of, it's somewhat indirect knowledge, right? And I think that's sometimes really dangerous. So the one thing that I want to kind of talk about a bit is testing and probably not always believing what Google is actually telling you, but kind of making up your own mind and your own decisions based on the stuff that you can actually see or that you probably need to do and then see and learn from it. So we set up this, this kind of, we call it playground. There's a whole bunch of different tests in there, you know, from canonicalization to indexing and a lot of other things. And I was really surprised when I looked at some of the results. And one of the things I brought for today is just a bit of the highlights. So the way the system works is not really, I mean, you need not to fully kind of understand it, but the idea is basically you can set up pages, you can add metadata, you can add header text, you can add content in different languages, and then you basically push it live. You send Googlebot, you track how Googlebot behaves, and then you get some kind of feedback, right? So is it either working the way you think it would be working, or is it working entirely different? And for some of the things, I was just really surprised, because let's just say it didn't work the way I was thinking it would work. So the first thing I want to quickly touch on is indexing and how Google behaves. So I'm going to see if you're all awake now. Can you raise your hands if you think this is a correct meta tag? If you think it's a correct meta tag, can you raise your hand? So you all think it's wrong? Yeah, I'm going to try it again, okay? That's hard, I know. So it's quite interesting. If you look at this meta tag, that's actually wrong. However, it looks kind of right, because the proper annotation would be this. So it shouldn't be value, but it should be content instead, right? There's a specification out there, W3C, that somewhat kind of defines how a meta tag is supposed to look like. However, if you look how Google behaves, so this is taken from Search Console, I'm sure you have seen that at some point, like the inspect element tool, and actually Google is apparently also accepting wrong annotations. So I was like, that's weird, why would they do that? So another thing that we, and it doesn't matter if you turn it around, so if you take a right meta tag and a wrong meta tag and you combine them left or right, it doesn't really make a difference. They seem to be following it, which I found quite interesting. The other thing that really struck me as well was, if you look at this, at first glance, again, it's a bit of the same story, it looks almost correct, but if you have been playing with it, you might have noticed that the S is missing, so it should not be robot, but robots instead. Tiny, slight difference there, right? However, again, Google apparently is somewhat auto-correcting this. So this should not work, right? But apparently right now it does. So Google is also somewhat accepting like a wrong annotation here, not even in the attributes, but also in the values. I was like, why would they do that? So there's some kind of autocorrection going on there. Another thing that I came across when we were playing with it, so the way this works, or let's say the way it's supposed to work, is that we have two different directives in this case, right? So the first is kind of a generic directive saying, for every crawler that comes to this site, don't index, right? Do not put it in your index. But the second annotation says, like, if you are Googlebot, then it's okay to do that. So that's how it works, right? So the question there is, would Google be following the more restrictive annotation, so saying like it's no index, because it's no index for everyone, or would they actually stick to, okay, this is a specific directive for Googlebot, so it's fine to put it to the index? That actually worked as it's supposed to work. So in the documentation, it says like if there's a specific user agent directive, being Googlebot in this case, then please follow that. And that's what they're doing here, right? So in this case, that specific URL is being okay, and Google says, like, okay, I put it in the index. So that works fine. However, when you go a bit deeper, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's also, you can control indexing also using server headers, right? So xrobots header. And so my logic was, so if I would be adding an xrobots header that only says robots, so not specifically for Googlebot, this should not change, right? Because the documentation says, the most specific user agent wins. So in this case, I'm just adding another generic user agent directive to the mix, select no index, but hey, as long as there's Googlebot in the meta tag, that should be fine. However, it's not. So one of the things they're doing here, and that's really interesting, is apparently the handling of directives in the header versus the handling of directives in meta is two different pipelines. And that was quite new, and this is also not how it's in documentation. So what you can learn from this, I suppose, is like if you have anything funky going on in server headers, and this is really important for those of you who build tools, because all the tools that I've been playing with, they get it wrong. So they all say it would be indexable, but it's not. If there's a no index in the head, it doesn't matter what you put in the meta tag, even though the documentation says differently. So that was quite interesting as well, I think. So there's a whole bunch of tests in there. I put the slides online later if you want to go through them and see if the results are what you think they are. There's some interesting kind of surprises in there. So the second thing is also very interesting. So another test that we've been doing is, so on the left you have a URL that has JavaScript, right? So what it does basically is it's adding a meta tag using JavaScript and set it to no index. That's what's going to happen here. However, on the right-hand side, you see that the crawling from Search Console has been done with Googlebot Desktop, right? And what I found really strange is that apparently Google Desktop is picking up JavaScript. I was like, why? Because my understanding was there's an old Googlebot and there's a new Googlebot, right? So the desktop one, the old, kind of very, very old Google one, the dumb crawler, let's put it that way, and the smartphone one that also has like the Chrome something version number in it, that's actually the one that's rendering the site as well, right? That's what they always said, like there's two ones. We have the old one, we keep the old one, we have the new one. So I was like, why would they actually pick up, why would the old crawler like pick up the JavaScript? It doesn't make any sense, like not at all. So, and then if you look at it, so this is taken, so we built like a crawler tracker, basically JavaScript. If you look at it, what happens when you use Search Console and you put the URL and you submit it to the index, they're always hitting this URL twice, literally within the same 1 to 2 seconds. So there's always this request, which is the old bot, and then there's the new one, right, with the Chrome user agent. And then if you look at the seconds, so point 18 and point 19, I was like, maybe what Search Console does is they just show kind of the first request, but they kind of might be putting this together. So I was like, I was asking John Mueller, I was like, guys, are you maybe kind of joining directives, right? So are you overlaying the old crawler versus the new crawler and then just merge the info? He was like, no, we're not doing this. But it's fairly normal to kind of, as Google says, right? Very vague. It's fairly normal to kind of see crawling with the other user agent as well. Well, that didn't really help me, but like when you look at this is from our crawl tracking. So if you go through it, you could see like every URL on the left is going to be hit twice. So all the time, desktop and smartphone. I was like, this is really strange. So what they then kind of came back with, and that was quite interesting. So apparently, Googlebot Desktop in Search Console does not necessarily mean it's the old Googlebot. So there is a Googlebot Desktop, correct, the old one that we have, but there's also a Googlebot Desktop that's actually rendering. This is super confusing. So essentially, there's like 3, if you so will. So the smartphone crawler is always rendering, but the desktop one can be and cannot be rendering. I was like, that's quite confusing. But I found that quite interesting. So the only way to understand this is if you would be looking for if that crawler is executing JavaScript using feature detection, you would understand if they are rendering or not. They switched to Chrome 77. You recall there was this announcement, Evergreen Googlebot, so that was on the 20th last month. And this leads me to another very interesting topic, which is JavaScript. Very quickly. So one of the things that I kind of come across all the time when we do like audits, we have websites that have those overlays, right? And kind of Google's stance always was like, and this site, you know, if you don't do anything, if you do not press the accept button, nothing will happen, right? There's no content on this site. So Google's always like, you know what, like if there's an overlay and the content is not visible, you literally can't rank. So what we did is we built this test case. You can see here in Search Console. If you fetch and render it, you see on the right-hand side the JavaScript is being executed, so they understand the JavaScript. If you look in the markup, which is also from Search Console, you can see here that we just used like a simple display none to hide the content, so relatively straightforward. So the content was there, or is there, but it was just not being displayed, right? So that's how it worked. If you then search for 2 phrases, so the first phrase is taken from content on the page, so both from content on the page actually, but what happens is, and that's quite interesting, even though the layer is there, the site will actually be returned for a phrase, no matter if the content is visible or not. So this entire stands on like, you know, if the content is not directly visible, it can't rank, is not true. I'm not saying necessarily, if you do that on a very, very large scale, that you can rank as well as with visible content. Don't get me wrong, that might be a different story, but I think this like, if it's not there, it can't rank, it's just not true. Which leads me into another thing that we've been playing with, which is visibility of content with different types of CSS. So we've been trying, I mean, the classic scenario you come across is, right, you have a bunch of content, and there's a read more button, and then it kind of expands, right? So it kind of there's more content visible after you click. So a very classic kind of scenario. And I wanted to kind of verify what happens, because that was another discussion. If I take a text string, like from here, I know you can't read it, but like, I think you get the idea. So there's the first paragraph is there, the second paragraph is only visible if you put like if you push the button. I wanted to verify what happens with the content that's only being kind of, if it's folded down, right? So, and no matter if it's visible or not, the content will be found. Like, I mean, this is like the same discussion, right? People say like, well, if it's not there, which is not true. There is an interesting difference if you compare left and right. So the first phrase here is taken from a paragraph that's visible. So the difference here is that you get the highlight, right? So you have the bold phrase in the meta description. The second phrase on the right is taken from content that's not directly visible, only if you click. So the difference here is, and you can see it probably, it's not going to be used in the meta description, so you lose the highlighting. That's the only difference. However, again, the page is being found. We've been playing with a whole bunch of them. You can see them on the left, so there's a bunch of like CSS ways, obviously, to hide and show content. The interesting thing is, if you be using overflow, so the fourth in the list, you even get or can kind of preserve the SERP, like the highlighting. So if you have the necessity to use any kind of content expansion on your site for whatever means, I would try to make sure that you do it with CSS using overflow, because then you're kind of not losing the highlighting in the search results. I found that quite interesting, because every other method, you kind of lose a bit of an advantage in the snippet. Quickly moving forward, because there's a whole bunch of stuff in here, but we also tested that with like JavaScript libraries. There's plugins for jQuery, there's plugins for everything else. As long as they are using this overflow mechanic, and read more JS, for example, is doing that, you keep the highlighting. If not, you're basically losing it. But same story. So this was super exciting. So I had a discussion with a friend of mine. He was like, "Why are you playing with JavaScript?" Iframes, sorry. And I was like, iframes are not a thing. So if you look at this, I think iframes actually are a thing. Apparently, people are still using iframes. Quickly revisiting what happened in the past. So iframes work the way that we have a parent page, which is like the yellow one, right? And there might or might not be content on there. And then there's an iframe tag, iframe src something, and they're loading a separate URL into the site, right? This is how it worked. So very straightforward HTML. And in the past, it was like this, that the content in the iframe was somewhat isolated. So the parent page would rank for its content, but not for the content in the iframe. This is how it worked, right? So, I think you know where I'm getting to. When Google is rendering now, the content here, so Alice had no clear blah, 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 so that's a random phrase. This is not on the parent, but it's in the iframe. So the iframe content is now being attributed to the parent URL, which is quite interesting and also quite dangerous. So if you are actually using iframes to load third-party content, comments, UGC, whatever you have in there, the parent page is starting to rank, can start to rank for the content. You can see it here. This is taken from Search Console with the rendered HTML. And what you can see is this is the original iframe tag, and Google is actually putting this in kind of an HTML comment and then inlining all the content from the iframe URL. So if you want to play with it, just set up a simple test that I did, and you can see in Search Console that they're actually inlining the content from the iframe. There's a whole bunch of things that all of a sudden change because you need to think about what kind of impact have iframes, if I'm using iframes, of course, and might they even be kind of impacting my overall page or domain quality, those kind of things. Granted, very quickly on a side note, of course, if the iframe URL itself, so the one that you are loading, is put to no index, of course the parent can't rank for it. The same is true for if that is robots texted, right? We tested third-party iframes, we tested subdomain, we tested same domain, it's all the same. It doesn't make a difference. If the content is indexable, the parent URL can actually start to rank for it. We've been playing with hidden frames as well. That doesn't work either. So it needs to be a visible iframe, then the parent can rank for it. Just on a quick side note to revisit this, you might recall there was this post from Barry Schwartz. It said like, well, Google stops fetch and render the preview at 10,000 pixel. In Search Console at least, that is still true. So the desktop on the left is still 10,000 pixel. The smartphone preview stops at 1,700 pixel roughly, so that might be interesting. The reason why I've been playing with this is I was like, what if I would take content and push it further down, so let's say 15,000 pixel, just for the sake of it, and see if they're still rendering it, and if it still does rank. Because there was a lot of discussion around, like, if it's not in preview in Search Console, you might have a problem. And I was like, but why? Like, why should that be a problem? I mean, Google is greedy, right? Google wants every URL. Google wants all the content they can get. So there needs to be, there might be a different story. So what I did, you can see it here, in Search Console. So the second screenshot, there's just whole blank space. So this is like the end after 10,000 pixel. However, on the right, you can see I kind of did the same iframe, just big container, 15,000 pixel, pushed it down, then the same iframe. The content still ranks. So, and the interesting takeaway here, I think, is what Google is doing is there's two different kind of render stages, if that makes sense, or preview stages. So the preview is really only in Search Console. The cutoff is still there. But no matter what, if the content is further down, you will still rank for it. You cannot just see it in the preview. That's only the difference, I guess. Again, a whole bunch of iframe tests for later. So that's on the testing front. The other thing I want to kind of, it's a bit of the same topic, just from the other angle, I suppose. My other problem that I have a lot is that when I talk to people, obviously, everyone has somewhat own data sources and different data sources, and they look at this and they look at that. But I think it only starts to make fun if you get this all somewhat together, right? Because isolated, kind of siloed approaches is probably not the best way to do it. So, I'm really a huge fan of log files, because I think log files are somewhat the only, if you look at tech SEO at least, let's put it that way, if you look at tech SEO, are somewhat the only real truth, and no offense to all the crawling tools out there, I love you guys, but the problem is they are essentially just simulating what Googlebot is trying to do, but you would not necessarily understand the real behavior, right? So there's a whole bunch of them in here. There's, I mean, no recommendation, no affiliation, whatever you like. The major difference, I guess, is there is some that run on a desktop machine. There's some that run as a SaaS software solution, I suppose. Desktop, of course, at some point has a bit of scaling issues, if that makes sense. So if log files are very, very large, you have this, the issue with up and downloading stuff, so it's just really annoying. If you are not using log files yet, sadly, I can't go into that. I put a deck on SlideShare. It's like everything, I guess, you need to know about log files for SEO. Because the one thing that I want to talk a bit about is actually something else. But before we go into this, there's like another one of my favorite quotes here, where I'm sure you have seen that because it's actually a couple of months old, where John Mueller said, like, well, you know what, like, I think crawl budget is overrated. Most sites don't really need to worry about this. It's an interesting topic, but only if you're a very large site. I mean, granted, okay, if you have 100 URLs, you probably do not need to worry about crawl budget. That's very true. But if we're talking about 10,000, 100,000, a million URLs, I think that might not entirely be true. And then if you look at Webmaster Central, Google actually themselves said, like, well, if you're wasting resources on pages, in a nutshell, that's not really a good idea. So that's somewhat, contrary on what they're saying there. So, and if you have to deal with, and if you ever had to deal with very large sites, and a whole bunch of parameters and all the stuff that's going on there, I almost will guarantee you that if you get this sorted, it will make a difference, right? And I know it's very hard to make any guarantees in SEO. Because oftentimes, almost all the time, I actually think, URL parameters are somewhat the biggest problem. So I was like, how can we make this better? How can we just not rely only on, because log files, again, only one single source. How do I get this all together? One of the things that I do like a lot is at least to combine log files with crawl data, because in log files, if I only look at the URLs, I would not know, for example, if a URL is actually allowed for indexation or not. Or is it maybe put on a no index, or is it blocked by robots text? If I purely look at log files, I have no clue, right? So one of the things you could do, if you go, for example, deep crawl, you go and you can start overlaying sources. So you could put in, your web crawl data and you merge it with log files. So that would be one approach. You can kind of drill down on URL level. You can understand, is a URL actually is it actually set to index or no index? And then you can understand, how much traffic does Google actually cause on this? Or you go like, okay, I have indexable pages that are not being crawled at all. So this is like a very simplistic approach to do that, but it works quite well. However, what you're missing with this as well, then, is since you're basing your analysis on the crawl data, you're somewhat missing crucial info, because what about URLs that are actually not linked? If they're not linked, the crawling tool wouldn't find it, so you would not have, again, you would have like this gap. So I was like, there needs to be another way to kind of deal with this and make it more actionable. So, and this is like, if you want to play with it, feel free. I have the email address at the end. It's kind of this entire setup. Happy to give it for free. It's based on a bunch of Google tools. It looks very complicated, but actually it's not, I promise. So what we did is basically we kind of started to join 4 different data sources. So log files, your analytics data from Google Analytics, your data from Google Search Console, your crawl data. We merge it all together. There's a service called Cloud Data Prep from Google. Then we put it all into a BigQuery. And then we use Data Studio. I'm sure you're familiar with this. And then to kind of visualize the output. So because that way, you have it all in one place. You have it all merged together. And you get finally like kind of an insight that actually makes sense, because you have traffic data, you have click data, you have indexing directives, and you have actually real Googlebot crawl behavior. And it's not really hard. So quickly before we do that, quickly having a look how this can look like. I mean, this is Data Studio. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. But you can do something like trends over time, crawlers over time, crawl behavior over time. You can do redirects, not only redirects based on status code, but redirects based on the crawler. What does the crawl with deep crawl return? Is it actually indexable? Does it have inlinks, etc., etc.? So this is now all of a sudden a picture that makes sense because you have all the data in one place. Essentially, it works by plugging together a lot of data sources, right? I mean, we basically need log files, again, no matter where you get them from. I suppose either from your web server, from your CDN, and or most likely both, because you want the full picture. And the way we do this is basically that we kind of collect them in one place. I know the problem, especially with large sites. We deal a lot with large sites. Like uploading, downloading is a pain. So there is services that can deal with this. Fluentd is the most popular one, I suppose, that can run on literally any web server out there, Apache, Nginx, but also on the CDN. So what they do is they stream your log file data into BigQuery, and you're essentially done. So that is really cool. Analytics has an API. I think you're all aware of that. So what we're trying to get there is, of course, sessions, users, bounce rates, so kind of all the engagement metric that makes sense, right? Search console, same story. You know, especially the performance data. I was very, very sad when they took this away. So I kind of was crying in the office, I think. It's like, why are you just taking this away? It's not funny. There's no replacement yet. Maybe it might come, maybe not. Of course, it's still, and that's the sad part, right? It's still there. In index coverage, you have it. So I'm not really fully sure why they took it away. Of course, you could then go and be like, okay, I exported, I downloaded, I uploaded, I hate this, like this takes too much time, I do not have time. So, but please be aware, so scraping Google Search Console might violate their terms of use. I'm not advocating this, I'm just saying there's a possibility to do that. So the data is still there, it's just not in an API, which is a bit of a pain. Then again, we take deep crawl, but we can take something else as well. Depends on what your stack looks like, but we take deep crawl to kind of get, you know, indexing directives, robots text, you know, deep rank and whatnot, just to have an idea of how the site is actually behaving. And then what we do is, and this is the stuff that I'm happy to share because this is what kind of the magic happens, is Google App Scripts. So Google App Scripts is essentially just a bit of JavaScript code, if that makes sense, that runs on the Google Cloud environment, and they take the data from GSC and then move it into BigQuery. So this is really straightforward. It's like, it's 4 scripts for each of the APIs, and you're essentially done. And then the really cool thing, so cloud data prep is, I kind of fell in love with that like a year ago. It's kind of like Excel on steroids in the cloud, if that makes sense. So I think that's how to phrase it. Because all the data sources have one thing in common, and that's the URL, right? So what you need is you need to merge all the sources based on URLs, and you need to normalize, and you need to handle the parameters. So this is what you can do with what we are doing with cloud data prep. And again, the cool thing with that is you can share kind of the progressing or the processing flow. So this is what you can get from us as well as a present, so to say. And then it goes on to BigQuery, and then you have Data Studio, right? So you can do something like crawl behavior on parameterized URLs, or you can go, so like, well, how does it work with if indexable URLs are, if URLs are actually not indexable? How are they behaving? So we are huge kind of, because people, a lot of the companies that we work with, let's put it that way, are somewhat using Data Studio already anyways, right? I mean, it's super popular, it's free, it is by now quite powerful. I think it's as long as you are okay compliance-wise to use the Google stack, I think it's a really good solution. So we thought like integrating it would be for us the easiest approach. So that's what kind of, we ended up with the Google stack. You know, and all the other stuff, crawl errors, you can even use it for, you know, web performance optimization and whatnot. So there's a whole bunch of data because now you have it all in one place. Leads me to kind of the third thing I want to talk about as well, and that's the last frustration for the day, I promise. So I know I'm ranting a bit because I don't know why, but I think there's this, like when people go out and give recommendations, they're not really considering the context and maybe the industry and maybe the size of a site, because there's not this one recommendation that's true for everyone. Like, and I think that's a very crucial point that people are somewhat missing. So we did this survey, it was in May, and I can also asking, so who had a freelance consultant and or agency deliver an SEO audit in the last 12 months? So that was basically the question that we were asking, right? And the results were a freaking disaster. So only 12%, and it was like roughly 200 participants, not large, but I think it was okay to get an understanding. Only 12% were saying, okay, we were like just really, really happy. But the rest was like, yeah, it was partially okay. And then 34 were like, oh, this is a total disaster. I was like, okay. And I think it's really sad, because if you think about it, that means that people are just burning money and time, and even more time, on somewhat worthless audits, right? And I mean, I've been looking into some of the stuff that we've been doing 5 years ago, and it looked like shit, honestly. Like, this is not, I think this is not the way it should work, because we were missing crucial context by recommendations that we were giving out. And speaking of worthless audits, if you take an export from Screaming Frog, again, I love Screaming Frog, don't get me wrong, and send this and say, like, this is my audit, this is shit. Seriously. Like, this is not an audit, right? So, yeah, I thought I should probably go back and kind of try to give a bit of an outline of what I think is going wrong here. So the one big thing that I think and that I see is going wrong all the time is wrong format and wrong output. Because people are not missing or not understanding, they're missing and not understanding what their audience really needs. Because there's a very, very different approach to kind of the goals that you're following. So, if you just want to have a buy-in from C-level, then I suppose 100 pages audit is not the right format. What they want is like 3, 4, 5 slides that are kind of actionable, that give you an overview, and that's it. They don't care about 100 pages audit. Like, this is totally wrong. Or on the other end, if you are working directly with IT teams or the dev teams, what we end up doing oftentimes is we start creating tickets for them. Like, so they don't want the 100 pages either. They just want, what are my tickets, what are my tasks, when can I get started, right? I mean, I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there is, because then we would probably all be out of work soon. That would be a shame. I'm not saying there is no need for like in-depth audits, right? But if you do them, please do them right. And at least do not waste my time. Like, I go entirely crazy when I see those 100 pages, and then there's no summary, or there's grammar mistakes in there, or there's not even the sources. I don't know what tools you're using. Like, how? I mean, I might be able to understand from the screenshot, but like, this is, I mean, put sources to it. Make an index that I can click on and kind of scroll down. Just make it easy to use, because otherwise you're wasting my time. For dev guys, provide examples. Like, code examples oftentimes help to explain what you actually want to achieve. Like, it's way faster as well. The other big thing that's wrong all the time, I think, is that people are actually more describing symptoms, but they're not really dealing or understanding the cause. So this is taken from an audit. I'm sure you have seen something like this at some point. So like, well, in our audit, we discovered a significant amount of duplicate page titles. Overall, the crawl returned like 55,000 duplicate titles. We recommend using unique page titles. And I was like, no shit, Sherlock. It's like, fantastic. And what now, right? So what am I supposed to do with this? Or even worse, I get this Excel export or spreadsheet, and it's like, here's a list of all the broken URLs. Deal with it. It's like, okay, how? Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, should I recreate it? Should I redirect them? Should I delete them? What do you want me to do? It's not actionable. It's a pain. It's a damn pain. So I think if we, as SEOs, would start kind of thinking more in kind of a pattern approach, I think that would solve a lot. So in this case, like, if you would have told me, like, there's 300,000 short meta descriptions, but, I understand that you have some of them that are more valuable, and that all the stuff is kind of caused by something that's somewhat broken when you're actually generating the page. This would help me. So here's my template, here's the top 100, I can go and implement straight away. So like, don't describe what's wrong, give me a solution, right? And the third thing that is really kind of annoying as well is the lack of priorities, and I understand why, because it's not as easy as it sounds, but if you do not tell me what's more important than the rest, what am I supposed to do? Like, I don't know where to start. If you sent me 100 pages, do I start at page 99 or page 1? I don't know. So I think like a kind of a table list, whatever format you fancy, but with impact and effort to it. And I think that's the crucial part. And then people ask me, how do we get to this? I guess, I mean, yeah, of course, there is a bit of experience that's somewhat eventually involved, but also, I mean, testing is a big thing. If you look at the data sources kind of combined, that can give you an indication of what's more important than others. So I think at least make it transparent on how you get to the numbers, but give me numbers. Otherwise, I can't work. I don't know what to do. Yeah? I also think that this 100 pages approach is actually not the right way. So we actually started doing to not include everything anymore. So like, I think the appendix is actually a good place to just put stuff that you have seen, but where you think it's not really crucial. A plan B is always a good idea, I suppose. If you go into a meeting, I think we all have experienced that. IT says like, well, I can't do this. And this also doesn't work. And by the way, that also doesn't work. So I think have a plan B for some of the stuff where you can anticipate that they might not be able to do that because of the CMS, because of the shop, because of whatever, right? And I think the last thing is that basically, I was saying this earlier, like understand what type of domain you're dealing with and understand the scope. So the question is kind of in which quadrant is the domain in that you're dealing with, because that is very, very much setting a perimeter on the recommendations, besides of the 3 issues that I kind of outlined, that I would expect. So if I tell you to do an audit for me, that I would expect to get from you. So as an example, so I kind of, sadly we do not have that much time, but as an example what I did is like I kind of put together the top 5 most important items if you'd be an e-commerce site on a scope of 10 to 100K URLs. Because I think that's the way you need to do it. You need to understand what's the scope, what's the site, what's the industry, what's the vertical. Of course, you can break it down even further. Just for the sake of it, I didn't do it. But what I would expect if you are an e-com, or the other way around, if I am an e-com, and if I tell you to do an audit, the first thing that I think is absolutely essential is to understand how you'd be handling multiple versions of a product. So in e-com, we have oftentimes this issue, you know, there's a product that's available in different colors and different sizes, et cetera, et cetera. So this case, this is taken from Nike, I think, yeah. And what they have a shoe called Flyknit 4, and what they do, for whatever crazy reason, they have it in X colors, and they create URLs for every other color. So what happens, product detail page exists in hundreds and hundreds of URLs. I mean, of course, you could do canonical tags. I'm not going to go into canonical tags now. But like the opposite, if you want to see like a great example of how that works really well, it's a company called Salomon. They do bundle everything on one URL, one product URL. They have kind of the client-side approach to it. You can still link into it. All the signals are canonicalized. They rank really, really well. So, you know, this way or that way. Understand, tell me how I'm doing with my product pages. That's the stuff that I'm selling. Same story, products, but reachable in multiple categories. Another kind of e-com classic. If you're not looking at this, how can you give me a recommendation on my shop? Not going to work. So in this case, they're selling socks or sock kind of packages, I suppose. What they're doing is the same URL sits one in /shop and one in /explore. I mean, obviously, that product detail page is never going to rank well. Or, you know, if you're dealing in e-com, what often happens is branded categories versus brand filter. So in this case, on the left-hand side, what you're seeing is you see the brand page, you see a category called watches filtered by the brand Breitling. And on the other hand, you see the Breitling brand page. So which one is the page that's supposed to rank for the query or for the keyword Breitling and all the Breitling kind of versions? If you're not telling me, I don't know. So understand this. Faceted navigation is a big one. Sorting, filtering, all of that, because it creates a whole bunch of URLs. Zalando is a great example if you, you might probably be familiar with them. So they, like all the sorting and filtering mechanisms on the top, if they would actually create individual URLs, that would mean millions and millions and millions of URLs that probably are not worth being there, because at the end of the day, there's no search demand for all of those different combinations. So understand how and if you really need to create filters and make them kind of available for indexing. Talking about filters a bit more, if you have a filter list like this on the right-hand side, you're just doing it wrong. Like, this is never gonna be going well in terms of your kind of SEO rankings. So first and foremost, before you think about SEO, just look into your analytics. And I promise like 90% of those filters are never being used at all in the first place, so just get rid of them, right? Filtering and sorting is, of course there's a need for it, but only to a certain extent. And if you give me like 20 options, I'm probably have too many options in the first place. There's a great example, again, Boots, a company in the UK. They do this client side, one URL, only a certain amount of faceted navigation is being allowed for indexing, so a really nice way to do that. Last point, and I'm almost done. Another big thing in e-com, especially with volatility, because products come, products go, tell me how to deal with out-of-stock stuff. Because what happens if things are not available anymore? So Marks & Spencer's is a great example on how not to do it. They have like 230,000 products in Google that are not being on sale anymore. So, and then I land there, I bounce back. my user metrics on the site are going down because this is a shitty experience, the site suffers. So please tell me how to deal with this. Oftentimes, this is something like redirects to follow-up product, to kind of following products. It's going to be successor products. It's going to be eventually redirect to internal search result, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of ways how to deal with it, but tell me what I need to do. And that's also true for categories, right? If you have a lot of volatility in categories, also tell me how to deal with this. Of course, this top 5 would be totally different if you'd be into publishing or if you would be into classifieds, because your site is totally different, so this is only valid for e-com. And then there's a whole bunch, we're not going to go through them because I only have 30 seconds left. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's valid for each and every one of them. So of course there is some generic stuff in there, don't get me wrong, but like first and foremost, I want you to tell me what is special to my site, what is special to the industry and the environment I am in, and don't give me like the shitty default standard stuff that I know about already anyways. I'll leave you with a summary. I think testing is absolutely crucial. Siloed data is not a good way to do it, so kind of try to start joining sources. And lastly, do not give me default, please tailor it to my needs. And that's all I've got for today. Thank you very much. You're not getting a microphone.
Thanks so much, Bastian.
You're welcome.
Is there any question for his presentation? Yes.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
First of all, thank you so much for the fruitful information today.
You're welcome.
You previously mentioned about the iframe.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite hectic. Suppose we basically don't want to have that content be captured by Google Search Console.
Yeah.
Is there any way that we can block it, eliminate, or basically restrict it? Hopefully, like, I don't know, possibly by reverse SEO, if I'm too hopeful, I'm not sure.
Yeah, what you can do, so what you can do, the way the iframe works, obviously it's loading a second URL, right? So it's like, this is domain.com/content/myiframe something. If this URL itself would serve and contain a meta no index, they won't pick it up. They only take the content if the URL that you're loading with the iframe is indexable. So either no index or robots text still works. Only if you're not doing anything, which sadly most people do, then they will pick it up. So there is a way to do it. It's not hard. You just need to be aware that you need to put a no index on the inner URL, if that makes any sense.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Faster. Sorry. That's a long way.
Hi.
Hi.
I am Yum. I loved your presentation. Actually, you started by telling us how Google kind of disrespects the no index tag. I mean, not really, but my question is, have you made any tests regarding the canonical tag? What is the behavior of Google regarding the canonical tag?
Yeah, I mean...
Is it the same disrespect that it does to the no index?
You know, I almost said it's going to be worse, sadly, at least so the problem with I think that the fundamental difference of a canonical tag and a no index tag, the no index is at least, I mean, normally a directive. The canonical is only a hint, right? And our experience, at least somewhat in the real world, is that the canonical tag, I would say, almost rarely works the way it's supposed to work. I mean, we did a bunch of tests. They're in there. The problem is canonicalization testing is really hard on a testing environment, mainly because one of the things I didn't mention due to time reasons is, of course, that behavior might also be different if you have a domain that's older versus a test domain, or a domain that's mobile first indexed, switched, versus one that's still on the desktop. So we tested all of them, and the results somewhat are slightly different, but coming back to your question, so the canonical tag, I think right now, we rarely rely on it in the first place. And if we rely on it on the canonical tag, we try to make sure that the source URL and the destination URL, the content, is almost identical. I think that's the only way to really try to make sure that they respect it. If that's somewhat different, oftentimes I'd say in the real world it doesn't really work. I have a bunch of canonical tests. If you want to find me later, I can show them to you. But like I'm not a fan of the canonical tag. Let's put it that way, because like I think when I invest time to implement something and like so I set my indexing and all the directives correct, and I would ideally want Google to follow them. And for the canonical tag, it's way worse than anything else. So that's why I'd rather rely on redirects if I can, or no index if that's the other way around, but like rather not with a canonical tag.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, that's it. Perfect. Thank you very much.